Story 1. Story 1, The Whispering Walls. It started with the smell. A sickly sweet, cloying scent that permeated my small, brick bungalow, clinging to the curtains and nesting in the carpets. I initially dismissed it as a new air freshener from Mrs. Henderson next door. She had a penchant for exotic fragrances, the kind that made my sinuses ache. We shared a thin, brittle wall, and sounds, and apparently, smells, traveled easily. "Something new you're trying, Martha?" I'd called over the fence one crisp October afternoon, the smell particularly potent that day. She'd just smiled, a vacant, unnerving smile that didn't reach her pale, watery eyes. "Just trying to freshen things up, dear." That should have been my first warning. Martha Henderson was never a dear kind of person. The smell intensified over the next few days. It became less floral, more organic. Like overripe fruit left to rot in the sun. I started noticing other things too. A low, rhythmic thumping coming from her side of the wall, always at night. At first, I assumed it was a new appliance, maybe a humidifier. But the rhythm was too irregular, too fleshy. My sleep became fractured, punctuated by nightmares of pulsing, organic shapes and the constant awareness of that sickeningly sweet smell. I found myself jumping at shadows, my hand perpetually hovering over the phone, ready to dial 911. One evening, while making dinner, I heard a distinct scratching sound. It seemed to be coming from inside my wall, right by the shared kitchen space. I froze, a forkful of pasta suspended halfway to my mouth. The scratching stopped, then started again, more insistent this time, accompanied by a low, guttural whisper that made my blood run cold. I pressed my ear against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispering grew louder, coalescing into words I couldn't quite decipher. It sounded like begging. A desperate, pleading whisper that vibrated through the wall and into my bones. "Martha?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no reply. Only the scratching and the whispering, closer now, as if whatever was trapped inside the wall was trying to claw its way through. Driven by a primal fear, I grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from the stove. My hands were slick with sweat. I raised the skillet above my head, my breath caught in my throat, and slammed it against the wall. The whispering stopped. The scratching ceased. A thick, viscous liquid, the color of curdled milk, oozed from the crack I'd created in the plaster. The sweet, rotting smell intensified, almost overpowering. I stumbled back, gagging, my stomach churning. I didn't sleep that night. I sat huddled on the sofa, the skillet clutched in my lap, every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside my window, sending jolts of terror through me. The next morning, I called the police. They came, 2 young officers, their faces etched with polite skepticism. They searched Martha's house, but found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no disturbance. Just the lingering sweet smell, which they attributed to poor ventilation. They dismissed my concerns as nerves, suggested I see a doctor. But I knew. I knew something was terribly wrong. That night, the scratching started again. Louder this time, more frantic. And the whispering, it was different. No longer pleading, but angry. Raging. I packed a bag, threw some clothes and essentials inside, and fled. I couldn't stay there, not anymore. As I drove away, I looked back at Martha's house. The curtains were drawn, the lawn overgrown, the whole place radiating an aura of unsettling stillness. I haven't been back since. I live in a small apartment now, miles away from that quiet, tree-lined street. But the smell, it still lingers. Faint, but unmistakable. And sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet, I can hear the scratching. The whispering. Coming from inside my walls. I've started noticing things in my new apartment too. A strange discoloration on the ceiling, a rhythmic dripping from the faucet that doesn't seem to be connected to the plumbing, a fleeting glimpse of something moving in my peripheral vision. And last night, I heard Mrs. Henderson's voice. Clear as a bell, right outside my door. Just trying to freshen things up, dear. Story 2. Story 2, The Whispering Pines. The move to Whisper Pines felt like a fresh start. A quaint, secluded community nestled amongst towering pines in the Oregon wilderness. My wife, Sarah, and I needed a change after the city drained us dry. The crisp mountain air, the earthy scent of pine needles, the quiet, it was exactly what we craved. Our little cabin, with its wraparound porch and large windows overlooking the forest, felt like a sanctuary. The neighbors were different. Not unfriendly, exactly, but reserved. Mr. Henderson, a wiry man with eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of the woods, lived directly across from us. His wife, a frail woman who rarely left the house, would sometimes sit on their porch swing, her gaze fixed on the trees as if waiting for something. Their twin daughters, pale and silent, were a constant presence, flitting through the trees like shadows. One evening, a few weeks after we settled in, I was chopping wood in the backyard, the rhythmic thud of the axe echoing through the stillness. Sarah was inside, humming a tune as she unpacked boxes. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows from the pines. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl resonating from deep within the woods. I paused, straining my ears. It sounded almost animalistic. I glanced toward Henderson's house. He was standing on his porch, staring into the trees, an unsettling calmness on his face. The growling continued, interspersed with a rustling sound, as if something large was moving through the undergrowth. I called out to Sarah, telling her to lock the doors. My heart pounded in my chest. The air grew cold, despite the summer evening. The wood seemed to press in on us, the towering pines transformed into menacing sentinels. The next morning, I found strange tracks in the soft earth near the edge of the woods, large, three-toed prints unlike anything I'd ever seen. I mentioned it to Henderson, hoping for an explanation. He just shrugged, a strange glint in his eye. The woods have their secrets, he murmured, turning away. Over the next few weeks, the unsettling occurrences became more frequent. We heard whispering outside our windows at night, whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves. The growling became a nightly occurrence, accompanied by the rustling in the undergrowth, closer now, as if whatever it was circling our cabin. Sarah became increasingly agitated, jumping at the slightest sound. I tried to rationalize it, blaming it on the isolation, the unfamiliar surroundings. But deep down, a primal fear began to take root. One particularly dark night, the growling intensified. It was right outside our bedroom window now. Sarah clutched my arm, her body trembling. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously peered out the window. In the beam of light, I saw them, the Henderson twins, standing at the edge of the woods, their pale faces illuminated by the flashlight. They stared back at me, their eyes wide and unblinking. Then, they turned and vanished into the darkness. The growling stopped. The following day, I confronted Henderson. He denied any knowledge of his daughters being outside our house the previous night. They were asleep, he insisted, his voice eerily calm. You must have been mistaken. The atmosphere in Whisper Pines grew heavier, more oppressive. A thick fog rolled in, shrouding the community in an unnatural gloom. The pines seemed to whisper louder, their voices laced with malice. We felt constantly watched, as if unseen eyes were following our every move. Sarah became withdrawn, barely speaking. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking gaunt and fragile. One evening, while Sarah was sleeping, I heard a scratching at the back door. I froze, listening intently. The scratching stopped. Then, a soft tapping began, slow and deliberate. I grabbed a poker from beside the fireplace, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I crept to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. I flung the door open. Standing on the porch was Mrs. Henderson. She looked even frailer than usual, her eyes wide with a strange intensity. She held out a small, intricately carved wooden box. "For you," she whispered, her voice raspy. "From the woods." I hesitated, unsure what to do. She thrust the box towards me. "Take it," she hissed, her voice taking on a strange, guttural quality. I took the box, my hand trembling. It felt cold, almost alive. Mrs. Henderson turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog. I closed the door, my mind reeling. I placed the box on the table, afraid to open it. Sarah stirred in her sleep. "What was that?" she murmured. "Nothing," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Go back to sleep." The scratching at the door began again, louder this time, more frantic. I looked at the box. The scratching intensified, accompanied by a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the floor. Sarah sat up in bed, her eyes wide with terror. "What's happening?" she whispered. I didn't know what to say. I stared at the box, the scratching growing louder, the growling closer. The fog pressed against the windows, as if something was trying to get in. The box began to vibrate, a low humming sound emanating from within. The scratching stopped. The growling ceased. A heavy silence descended upon the cabin, broken only by Sarah's ragged breathing. I looked at her, my heart filled with dread. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, knowing she was right. But as I reached for the box, a strange compulsion came over me. I had to open it. I had to see what was inside. My hand trembled as I lifted the lid. The box was empty. But then, I heard the whispering again, closer than ever, right outside the window. And this time, I understood what it was saying. "Welcome home." The fog swirling outside suddenly seemed to coalesce, forming a dark, swirling mass against the window. And within that swirling darkness, I saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me, filled with a malevolent intelligence that chilled me to the bone. We never opened the box again. We packed our things and fled Whisper Pines in the dead of night, leaving everything behind. We never looked back. But the whispers followed us, the growling echoed in our dreams. And sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I can still feel the cold, unsettling presence of the woods, watching, waiting. What was in the woods? What did the whispers mean? Why did Mrs. Henderson give us the box? These questions haunt me still, a constant reminder of the terror we experienced in Whisper Pines. And I know, deep down, that whatever lurks in those woods, it's still out there, waiting for its next victims. Story 3. Story 3, The Mimicry. The clatter of Mrs. Henderson's wind chimes, usually a comforting melody, jangled my nerves. It was 3 a.m. I lay rigid in bed, listening. The wind hadn't been strong enough to move them that violently for days. Then, a soft, wet thud against the wall, right beside my head, jolted me upright. My heart hammered against my ribs. Our semi-detached house in suburban Ohio felt different that night. Colder. The air hung thick and heavy, laced with a strange, coppery smell I couldn't place. I strained my ears, trying to identify the thudding sound. It came again, softer this time, like something large shifting its weight. "David?" I whispered, nudging my husband. He grumbled something incoherent and rolled over. David, bless his heart, could sleep through an earthquake. I got out of bed, the floorboards creaking beneath my bare feet. The hallway was unusually dark, even the faint glow from the streetlight seemed muted. I crept towards the wall adjoining Mrs. Henderson's house. Pressing my ear against the cool plaster, I listened. Silence. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl vibrated through the wall, resonating in my chest. It wasn't a dog, not a cat, not any animal I'd ever heard. Fear, cold and clammy, gripped me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The next morning, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a stray animal had gotten trapped between the houses. Maybe Mrs. Henderson had a new pet. I even considered telling David, but he'd just look at me with that amused, slightly condescending smile and tell me I was imagining things. Over the next few days, the sounds continued, growing more frequent and more disturbing. Scraping sounds, like claws on wood. Heavy breathing. Sometimes, I'd hear a low, rhythmic clicking, like teeth chattering, that made my skin crawl. I started avoiding Mrs. Henderson. We'd always had a friendly, if distant, relationship. She was a widow, her children grown and gone, and I'd often check in on her, bringing her cookies or offering to run errands. Now, the thought of even seeing her filled me with a primal dread. One evening, I noticed her garden gnome, a particularly hideous, cherubic thing, was missing. Then, 2 days later, it reappeared, its painted smile subtly altered, almost malevolent. I chalked it up to the neighborhood kids, but a shiver ran down my spine. The climax came a week later. David was away on a business trip, and I was home alone, trying to distract myself with a book. The clicking sound started, louder than ever, accompanied by a low, rhythmic thumping. It seemed to be coming from Mrs. Henderson's bedroom, directly on the other side of my own. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. Then, a voice, Mrs. Henderson's voice, but distorted, deeper, rasping, whispered through the wall, "Hello, dear." My blood ran cold. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my fingers shaking so violently I could barely press the buttons. As the operator answered, I heard a loud crash from next door, followed by a chilling shriek, then silence. The police arrived quickly, sirens wailing, lights flashing. They broke down Mrs. Henderson's door. I watched from my window, my heart pounding in my chest, as they searched the house. They emerged a few minutes later, shaking their heads. No Mrs. Henderson. No signs of forced entry. Nothing out of the ordinary. Except one of the officers, a young man with a bewildered expression, pointed to a small, intricately carved wooden bird perched on Mrs. Henderson's windowsill. "Did you see this?" he asked, his voice hushed. "It's chirping." The chirping wasn't the cheerful melody of a songbird. It was a low, guttural clicking, punctuated by a soft, rhythmic thumping. The same sound I'd heard through the wall. The police left, attributing Mrs. Henderson's disappearance to dementia or perhaps a sudden, unexplained trip. They promised to investigate further, but I knew in my heart they wouldn't find her. Not in the way they expected. I haven't slept properly since. Every night, I hear the clicking and thumping, sometimes faint, sometimes deafeningly loud. The wind chimes clang incessantly, even when there's no wind. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear a voice, Mrs. Henderson's voice, but distorted, deeper, rasping, whispering my name. Last night, I noticed my own garden gnome was gone. This morning, it reappeared, its painted smile subtly altered, almost malevolent. And in its tiny ceramic hand, it clutched a single, intricately carved wooden feather. Story 4. Story 4, The Whispering Walls. The late afternoon sun cast long, creeping shadows across my living room floor. Dust motes danced in the golden rays, a peaceful scene shattered by the insistent, rhythmic thumping from next door. It had started a week ago, a low, dull thudding that vibrated through the shared wall of our semi-detached house. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just Mrs. Henderson rearranging her furniture. Again. Mrs. Henderson. A frail, bird-like woman with a perpetual frown etched onto her face. We'd exchanged pleasantries over the years, the usual neighborly chit-chat about the weather and bin collections. Nothing more. But the thumping continued, day and night, an incessant, unsettling pulse in the quiet suburban street. It seeped into my dreams, a persistent drumbeat against the backdrop of my subconscious. My concentration fractured, my work suffered. I started to feel watched. One evening, as the thumping reached a fever pitch, I went outside, intending to politely inquire about the source of the noise. As I approached Mrs. Henderson's door, the thumping stopped. Abruptly. I stood there for a moment, hand hovering over the doorbell, a strange unease settling in my stomach. I rang the bell. Silence. I rang again. Still nothing. Just the unsettling quiet and the oppressive weight of the darkening sky. I returned to my house, the unease solidifying into a cold dread. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the silence. It was a different kind of silence now, thick and heavy, pregnant with something unspoken. Then I heard it. A whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible, coming from the wall. "Help me." I bolted upright, heart hammering against my ribs. I strained my ears, listening intently. Silence. I told myself it was my imagination, the product of stress and lack of sleep. But the whisper, though gone, had left a chilling resonance in the room. The following days were a blur of escalating paranoia. The thumping returned, more insistent than ever, accompanied by the whispers. They grew louder, more desperate, weaving themselves into the fabric of my waking hours. "They're watching. Don't trust. Help." I started seeing things in the periphery of my vision, fleeting shadows that darted away when I turned to look. My reflection in the mirror seemed wrong. The eyes, slightly too wide, too knowing. I felt a constant, prickling sensation on my skin, like I was being observed, scrutinized. One evening, I saw Mrs. Henderson's curtains twitch. I rushed outside, driven by a desperate need for answers, for some semblance of normalcy. I hammered on her door, yelling her name. No response. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. The house was dark and eerily silent. The air hung thick with the smell of dust and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet. I called out Mrs. Henderson's name again, my voice echoing through the empty rooms. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw it. A dark, viscous liquid seeping from under the closed door of the basement. The thumping started again, emanating from behind the basement door. Louder this time. More frantic. The whispers intensified, coalescing into a chilling chorus. "Too late. She's gone. You're next." I backed away, my mind screaming, my body frozen in terror. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers numb and clumsy. I dialed 911, the numbers blurring through my tear-filled eyes. The police arrived, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. They broke down the basement door. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. The basement was empty. No Mrs. Henderson. No source of the thumping. No sign of the dark liquid. Just bare concrete walls and the lingering scent of dust and that sickeningly sweet metallic odor. The officers questioned me, their expressions ranging from skepticism to pity. They searched the house, the garden, the surrounding area. Nothing. Mrs. Henderson had vanished. I tried to explain about the thumping, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent. They looked at me like I was crazy. And maybe I was. I moved out the next day, unable to bear the silence of the house, the weight of the unseen eyes. I tried to put it behind me, to convince myself it was all in my head. But the whispers followed me. They're still there, faint and persistent, lurking in the shadows of my mind. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world is quiet, I hear the thumping. It's not coming from next door anymore. It's coming from inside my own walls. And the whispers, they've changed. "We've found you. You can't hide. Soon,